This is the reading of chapter 17 of Lester Sumrall's book, My Story to His Glory. Do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. That would help me out tremendously. Also, if you'd like to give to the cause, two ways, PayPal there and Cash App. It's always a great encouragement when I see one of those come across. Chapter 17 is entitled, Into the Heart of the Great South American Continent. Place your finger on a map on the Tropic of Cape Horn. Running directly through the center of South America at 60 degrees west longitude, and you will be touching the heart of the great South American continent. As the eagle flies, it is about 1,800 miles north of the Caribbean Sea, off Venezuela, and another 1,800 miles south of Tierra del Fuego, off Argentina. To the east of that geographical position, it is about 700 miles to the enormous expanses of the Atlantic waters, and to the west, 700 miles to the tranquil bosom of the Pacific. In this vast Grand Cacao heart of South America live many tribes of the original men of this continent. They can be correctly called forgotten men, as they have been neglected by governments and charities and philanthropic societies and most religious communions. They, with their brother tribes, from the mighty Aztecs of Mexico to the Onis and Tehuelches of Patagonia, have suffered themselves to be at least last and almost lost. I have never been confronted with more dire poverty and depressing human hopelessness than I found among the indigenous peoples of Latin America. What an eye-opening experience this was for me. These people comprise an estimated 356 known tribes, many of them existing in a state of cannibalism and savagery. The Spanish found the Incas living in the houses of granite. I found their descendants living in houses of mud. Once this proud race wore golden ornaments, but I saw the current residents of the area wearing copper and alloys like brass. This tragic economic deterioration of the red man has been brought about by his white superiors, and much of it shockingly and sadly in the name of Christianity. I was appalled and grieved. I crossed the Panama Canal into South American continent and came into the country of Colombia. In the city of Sogamoso, I met Olympia de Lobo, Olympia Wolf, the cherished daughter of the prominent Colombian sculptor, herself an artistic genius. At the time, she was one of the most ardent Catholics in the city, known for her beautiful art objects and for her retouching and repairing the images that so many Catholics worship. Observers often commented that she had placed a divine loveliness in the countenance of the saints, and she would respond, "Yes, and so they are divine." The devotion of this Colombian woman to her church was admirable. I have not encountered many people in my worldwide travels who get up at 5 o'clock, go to church, and pray. Later in the morning, she would retrace her steps to the church altar to offer her prayers to the various saints and spend another 1.5 hours in such devotion. The first Friday of each month, she would take a special communion, and in her home, holy lamps burned before pictures of Mary and Christ. These lamps were not extinguished for 10 years when this talented and devoted woman came into contact with the Bible. All the religious ceremony, the pomp and glory of the church did not satisfy the heart of this artist. She longed intensely for something she did not possess, and the sorrows of her heart were many. The prayers and rituals became tiresome, and she sought elsewhere for the peace her heart was demanding. At first, she purchased books on Spiritism, as many Latin Americans do, and began to study them. But her soul whispered to her that Spiritism was false. when she held the Bible in her hands and opened it. From the very first verse it gripped her soul. Avidly she read the Bible from cover to cover and began to pray, "Lord, put me among your chosen ones." The day when the Wagners, veteran Presbyterian missionaries, came to the Sogamoso district, where 1,000,000 people lived, but no missionary had been established, and refined Olympia de Lobo found herself among these chosen ones. Another 7 years were to go by, however, before Senora de Lobo recognized the truth of Isaiah 44 and verse 22. "I have blotted out as a thick cloud thy transgressions, and as a cloud thy sins. Return unto me, for I have redeemed thee." Inexpressible joy filled the soul of this artist when she realized that she was really redeemed. God had said so. For the first time in her life, she had the true assurance of her conversion. Then she was directed to read verses 9 and 10 in the same chapter. "They that make a graven image are all of them vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit. And they are their own witnesses. They see not, nor know they, that they may be ashamed. Who hath formed a god, a molten graven image, that is profitable for nothing?" God was speaking to her from his word. She went to the table and blew out her holy lamps on the family altar. She burned her many holy books and kept only her Bible. Then she rid her home of pictures of saints and charms and scapulas, written prayers and small statues that had been so much a part of her life for so long. And she cried out to God, "Lord, forgive me for being an idolatress. I did it in ignorance. Now I shall have no altar but my heart, and there Christ shall be my priest." Encounters such as this strengthened my resolve to help and encourage the missionaries and laymen and women I was privileged to meet. Precious souls such as Senora de Lobo needed to hear the message of redemption. Then it was on to Peru, where I met survivors of the horrendous glacial flood of 50-foot waves coming down from the Huascaran at 22,205 feet, the highest peak in the Peruvian Andes. The flood had destroyed the city of Juarez with its 15,000 inhabitants. When I was there 6 months later, the authorities were still finding pieces of the bodies of the dead. I learned of the persecution and the stoning of the first evangelical missionaries to that area. Then I heard of the miraculous protection afforded many of them during the flood, and saw their God literally divide the waters around the homes of those who prayed directly to him for safety. The water, I was told, plunged right through the Avenida Raimondi, a beautiful eucalyptus-lined promenade where not a tree or sprig of grass remained, only ghastly sepulchre white stones, making the place look like a cemetery. I met Dr. Walter Manuel Montano, called the Mountain Man of Peru. He told me the most amazing story of his escape from the Roman Catholic priesthood. Convinced of the validity of evangelical Protestantism, he sought to leave the Catholic Church, but they considered him a heretic. He told me so. He was held as a prisoner in a monastery in Lima for 6 years before escaping. After that, he said he felt he was in constant danger because he heard that someone in the church had offered plenary indulgence to anyone who would kill him. At one point, he was captured and thrown into the filthy dungeon. He was finally convicted of attempting to overthrow the Peruvian government, a trumped-up charge, and deported from the country. He came to this country and, interestingly, married a young woman from my brother's church in Chicago. Later, he proved his mountain strength and courage by returning to Peru, the place where he was most hated and persecuted, and took up his life's work in propagating the gospel of Jesus Christ. Defying the powers of the Roman and Peruvian government in his stand for religious liberty, he became pastor of the First Peruvian Evangelical Church of Lima, where I had the privilege of conducting union meetings of all evangelicals of the city. This was a rich experience. There were many others in different places with God's chosen ones. Paraguay is a small landlocked republic in the heart of South America. Here in Asuncion, the primitive capital, we traveled by train and then horseback to a wilderness leper asylum, 7,000 acres of lovely forested hills and valleys to visit the most forlorn folk in the world. These were the outcasts from the society, plagued with cancerous disease, living without any comforts of life to cheer them in their slow but inevitable death. Missionary Albert Widner and I had been invited by Mr. Normand, pastor of the International Church of Asuncion, to visit the Santa Isabel leper colony and preach to those desolate people. Inside the entrance gateway, we saw some 80 huts in which lived a community of 370 persons, not all of them lepers, but husbands, wives, children living together with and without leprosy. Of course, children are born in the colony, and they usually have to stay there as there is no other provision for them. It was indescribably sad to see boys and girls having no trace of leprosy, being reared in this undesirable environment. How my heart ached for them. I would have scooped them up in my arms and taken them back with me if I had been at all humanly possible. There, 3 of those fine, intelligent little boys, with no evidence whatsoever of leprosy, ran to us, took our horses to water, and later turned them out to pasture. The visitor must make the first advances of friendliness, as the lepers naturally feel that everyone is afraid of contracting their disease. So we made the rounds, greeting them personally. How can I describe what we saw? Next to the missionary's hut was a leper hospital where the advanced cases stayed awaiting death. In it we found 13 cots with creatures on them who defy verbal and written description. Their faces were badly deformed, some of their noses had already broken off, and others had perforations in their faces, through which putrid matter oozed. Their legs and their feet were in terrible condition, some of them resembling the hoof of a horse, and covered with malignant sores. Their hands were badly deformed, the thumbs seeming to sink back in their hand and fingers paralyzed. Their huts were filthier than any charitable institution I had ever seen, and some of them can be deplorably bad. They contained no floors and little furniture. Pieces of fresh meat were hanging from the wall or tied to the foot of the bed to be cooked the following day. As I looked up in one place, I saw a hole in the straw roof through which the rain came. As for the lepers, their clothing and bedding were rotting with filth. They begged for clothing, but we were unable to help them since we traveled so lightly ourselves. The missionary informed us that when blankets and sheets were given to them, they often sold them in order to obtain food. The only sanitary convenience was a primitive privy in the backyard. Small tin pans were provided for their bathing, but there was no free laundry service, which explained why so many of them were dirty. They could not wash their own clothing or bedding. Our next stop was the colony jail. Most of these lepers were not Christians. This explained the need for a jail. Shortly before our arrival, one leper had shot another, and this was not too uncommon. The colony had 6 policemen, all lepers. One of them, the chief, was allowed to carry a gun. I was amazed to see men from all the stations of life living in this colony. The first man we met had been a prominent man in the world. Now he was forgotten. He had been editor of 3 newspapers, a popular labor leader, and had been sent to Rome and Moscow as a delegate representing labor unions. But his skin became insensitive and the telltale mark of early leprosy. And soon the ulcers appeared along with gross disfiguration of his earlobes, hands, and feet. The government police, in a clean-up raid, dispatched him to the leper asylum. He was the most dignified and the cleanest leper in the colony and could make a guest feel at home even in a leper den. Another leper was a politician. We found a schoolmaster, 4 expert wood craftsmen, a tailor, a dressmaker, and many other skilled workers. The first lepers built their huts of mud, but those huts were being replaced with better ones, as professional carpenters were willing to work for the good of the community when it was possible for the missionary to supply them with tools and materials. More than 100 lepers came to our service. I looked out at those despairing individuals living with a death sentence hanging over them, waiting for some word of hope in their hopeless situation. It was difficult to keep from weeping as a group of lepers sang the Spanish rendering of Our Home Over There. I poured out my heart to them, giving them glorious, life-giving words from the gospel of Christ. I could feel our hearts united, and when the appeal was given, many came forward for prayer. I regretted that we could not shake hands with these lepers or put our arms around them. You could feel that they needed and wanted this too, but it was forbidden. When we left, we had a 15-kilometer ride by horseback before we could reach the train station, and then we had a 10-hour train ride ahead of us. Some of the lepers gathered to say goodbye early the next morning, and as we rode away, we heard "Hasta la vista," until we meet again. We took the road back to civilization, to friends and the comforts of life, but there remained behind to suffer alone and remain the forgotten ones, until we would meet again where leprosy never comes. My diary reminds me of the many interesting sights I saw in these countries. 10 mines were pointed out to us, and the Inca ruins displaying masonry more remarkable than any I had seen in London or Paris. We saw llama herds high in the Andes Mountains in Peru. Throughout the country, from time to time, we saw breathtaking vistas and beautiful rivers, waterfalls, and lakes. Wherever we went, I was intrigued by the people, and I always saw their faces and thought that they looked familiar. These, too, were the people I had seen in the vision as a young man. Buenos Aires, Argentina, is one of the finest cities in the world, the 3rd largest in the Western Hemisphere. Here, as elsewhere, I found that each Latin American country and city has its own national customs, but most of them were based on Spanish and Portuguese rules of conduct and manners. We came flying into Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, from the south by Panagra Airways, and witnessed below us the world's most beautiful harbor. In this great city, I was met by Brazilian jeweler Adalberto Arias, whom I had met 6 years previous when Howard Carter and I were in that city. Here was a jeweler by trade who accepted Christ and found him to be the pearl of great price. I met another interesting young man named Paulo Lobo, who was called the king of football by his countrymen. He had a remarkable conversion experience and was the foreman of a coffee company owned by his father. He was being used mightily by God to lead his workers to the Lord. These and other evangelicals warmly welcomed my interpreter and me, and the time spent in the great city was profitable for the Lord Jesus Christ. By December 1942, I had preached from Alaska at the top of the world to Argentina at the bottom, not omitting a single country en route. This book has only covered some of those travels, of course, but added to my burden for souls was the sad news from home that my sister Leona had been stricken with incurable, crippling muscular dystrophy. With this heavy on my heart, I crossed the immense Andes by train under the shadow of Mount Aconcagua, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, standing 33,000 feet into the heavens from Chile to the lovely city of Mendoza, Argentina, where once again I heard of Miss Louise Layman and the blessing she was to all the saints. Then, at a wedding in Buenos Aires, we came face to face. She smiled, and I smiled. That encounter was to change my life forever.